for joining me. I have Maxwell Ivey with me, and he is a fantastic individual, a multiple author. We're going to get into that first. Max, can you tell us, because I've found that you've got at least three books out there. Can you tell me what your process is as far as writing? Because I'm sure it's a little bit different than mine.
Right. So if we're going to talk about the process of writing the book, I keep it really simple. I just open up a text document and I write. And I've early in my writing career, I discovered a great editor. Her name is Lorraine Reguly, and her company is wordingwell.com. And she really helped me to get to that place where you just put it all down. You don't edit yourself while you're typing and you just keep going until you've either covered the subject you wanted to cover or until you just run out of energy and you ain't got no more left in your fingers, and you send it off and you let somebody else deal with the editing. And that's a hard place to get to. You've really got to trust your editor, or you got to trust your own sense of editing. But that's basically the way I do it. But I think the more interesting part of my writing is exactly how I wrote my first book, because I never planned on writing a book, much less four of them, much less being in the middle of a three-book series that I still need to deliver the third book of. But a few years ago, a woman challenged me to be part of a virtual summit. And she said that in order to be part of the summit, I needed to have something I could give away or something I could sell for a discounted price. And she said, I think you can write a book. She said, better yet, Max, I think you could write a book in 30 days or less. And I said, well, that sounds great for you to say it. I said, but if I tell somebody I'm going to write a book in 30 days and it's going to be part of promotional stuff and I don't do it, I'm going to tell them this is all your fault. So she said that would be fine. And she shared one of her favorite quotes with me, which was from Richard Branson. She said he likes to tell people, um, decide on a goal and then figure out how to get there. And so we started, and I started writing the book. And a few weeks later, she gets back to me. She says, Max, there's four other women in this virtual summit, and we've decided for marketing purposes it would be better if it was all women. So you're out of the
Oh
summit.
no.
You're
Oh
out of,
no.
and I, well, and the more if you've read much about me at all, you know that I tend to find the positive in the world, and
Sure.
a lot of that is the practice that I gained through being a small carnival operator for over half my life. So I told her, I said, in writing this book, I really rediscovered my love for writing and storytelling. And so even though I'm not going to be in the summit, I'm going to go ahead and finish the book. I said, and plus, I grew up in a family of carnival owners, so I know what it is to want to put more feet on the ground or butts in the seats or faces behind the screens in this case. So I wasn't mad. The only thing is I was writing the book and I got to that point where I'm like, okay, I've finished the book. I pretty much covered everything I thought I wanted to write about, but the book is only this long. It ain't, and I was having problems with thinking it wasn't long enough or important enough or didn't have enough uh, things to teach people about how to overcome the challenges in their life or overcome their excuses. And I was hanging on to it, and I shared it directly with a few friends. And one of them finally said, Max, this Lorraine woman that's helped you with with your website, I know she's an editor, so if you don't send this off to her and start the process of getting it published, I'm going to send it to her for you. And I'm like, well, what do I do now? So
And
I sent the book off, and we did get it published. It is available on Amazon, and it's even available on Audible because I
and
won
Max,
the.
what's the title on that one, just to
Okay,
help?
sure. I should have done that myself. It's
That's all
it's
right.
called
That's what
leading
I'm here
you out.
for.
It's called leading you out of the darkness into the light: a blind man's inspirational guide to success. And it's about 82 pages long, or about 3.5 hours if you read the audio version. And like I say, it went from a dare to writing on a book to actually finishing a book. And then a year or two after that book came out, I used several chapters of that book to compete for one of the Amtrak Writers in Residence Awards, which they no longer do. But back then, they would give writers free train tickets to travel around the country and get inspired to work on some sort of a writing project.
I love that idea. That
Oh yeah, it was a
that
great
sounds like a
idea, and
lot of
it
fun.
It actually came out of a practical experience. There was a woman visiting the U.S. from France. She flew into New York and couldn't get a plane to connect her flight to Chicago, where she was going to be speaking. She also had a book that she was having trouble finishing. The only way she could get to Chicago was to take the train. And she spent 2 days on the train from New York to Chicago, and she finished her book. And she wrote to people at Amtrak, and she also posted online about it. And Amtrak was like, "This is a heck of an idea. We got to get on this," and they did. And it was a great thing for them. It was a very good for building publicity around the fact that you can get work done. You can also have conversations and make meaningful connections with people on the train. But they've gone through several new CEOs since then, and they finally decided it was no longer a good investment.
Well,
But
you know what? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
come on, it's a few train tickets. I think it's one of those deals where somebody made a penny decision that's costing them dollars.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, we do have a love in the United States for the travel log. You look at Jack Kerouac's On the Road, considered one of the greatest works ever written by an American, and I think that created this passion for travel writing, and it's been popular ever since. I actually noticed there's a connection. We share in one of your articles. You mentioned Nulu, which is Doug's invention. I apologize, this last name just left my mind, but
Cats,
Doug
cats.
Katz, that's right. He was on the channel. I even mentioned him in, let's see, in my first book because he's so smart about intellectual properties. I had him on to talk about that. He really, really knows the in and outs of IP. For a guy who's not an attorney, he's super sharp about how to protect your IP, particularly inventions, because he really knows his stuff.
Well, there are some people that are great at educating themselves on any subject, and we both know there's nobody smarter than somebody who is really dedicated to knowing a subject. And in his case, he had this great invention, the Nulu knife, which is a knife he originally developed for people who have motor control issues, which just during the promotional work, though, he discovered a lot of visually impaired and blind people love it too. And I was lucky enough to get to mention the Nulu knife in my Consumer Reports article on simple things people can do dealing with new vision loss. And I was really happy that they decided to leave that link in the article because I figured, sure as the world, they would take that out since it was a product. But it was great to have him on my podcast. And, of course, with him, it's not just the Nulu knife. He wants to help lots of other veterans and people who want to support veterans to come up to develop their own products or in some cases services. And so he kind of sees himself as the parent of all these people he wants to come along with him. And so he felt motivated to learn about intellectual
FaceTime
property.
is launched in the background.
I'll let you take care of that,
No,
Max.
that's okay. It's good. It's just going to keep. I just can't stop it from ringing, but I'm good. So,
No, no
but like I
worries.
say, he sees himself in a parental role for all the entrepreneurs and inventors and creators that are going to come along as part of his project. So, he was invested in learning about intellectual property.
And congratulations on getting published in Consumer Reports because that's that company's huge. They've been around for as long as I can remember. I read the article and I was really it took me a minute to figure out what that one device is. What it looks like to me is it looked like a big long hair pick. And I usually I like to tease myself. I'll look at something first and try to figure out what it's for, and then I'll cheat and then read if I don't know what can't immediately figure it out. And it was the guide that guides the knife blade, which I think is genius. It has these spikes on the end that you can, so it looks like a hair pick to me, but you can actually insert it into the chicken or meat and use it as a slicer. It guides the blade, which I think is genius.
And his Nulu knife is a great example for my message around accessibility because you have a product that was designed for somebody with a disability that he then finds out can help even people with disabilities he wasn't aware of.
That's right.
But then he finds out that there's interest in it in not just the culinary world, the restaurants and fast food places that have to cut a lot of meat and vegetables. He finds out there's interest in it in the insurance world because the insurance carriers are thinking that if they get their restaurants to start using this device that will cause fewer repetitive stress injuries, they will save a lot of money. and it's just great. It's a great example of how when we improve accessibility for people who have disabilities, we open up so many other opportunities to
That's right.
improve the lives of people who don't have a disability.
Well, Max, you as a writer and a podcaster, you have the ability, which is, I think is great, is you can shine a spotlight on these things and platform these inventors, these people with ideas. So there's a great level of cooperation there. And as we discussed before coming on, I suggested that there's a tremendous competitive advantage because look, everybody talks about niche and you have to be in a niche and you want to be in an area where there's not a lot of competition. And I'm telling you, there are not enough businesses that think about accessibility. So you have to really think about how other people with other challenges are using items. I broke my shoulder 4 weeks ago, completely snapped it in half.
Yeah,
I can barely I couldn't get for 2 weeks, I couldn't get in or out of bed. And I slept in a lazy boy reclining style chair for 3 weeks because I couldn't, I didn't realize I needed two arms to get in and out of bed. So I had to completely change everything. And it got me thinking about Doug's Nulu knife and all the other things that we take for granted when we have both two operating arms. And in a way, I wish I had, not happy I broke my shoulder, but the lessons that I learned were valuable because I had to retool the entire way I did everything. And I actually started being a lot more active on my YouTube channel because I could sit here and I only need one hand to operate the equipment. So it made me very productive. I wrote less because I like to type with both hands, but I thought, what can I do that I can do with one hand? So I really got very active on the YouTube channel and glad to get to meet you. Now you're connected with Podmatch, aren't you? Do you work with
yes,
them?
yes, yes, I am. I am the accessibility advisor to Podmatch, and me and Alex Sanfilippo and Alicia Sanfilippo, the founders, have been good friends for several years. And in fact, he was the first person to hire me to work in the field of accessibility.
Wow.
And he was also one of the first to help me understand that I've been educating people about accessibility for almost 20 years now, whether I knew it or not. Because anytime I had a problem with a website or an app, I would reach out to the owner and I would go, "These are my problems, and I'm hoping you can help me solve them." Either by changing the product or by helping me find workarounds. Sometimes they would respond favorably. A lot of times they just ignore me, but I've been educating people, for many, many years. And he's like, you can never underestimate the value of lived experience. And also, you mentioned my being a storyteller and a podcaster and a writer. One of the things that is important is being able to communicate to developers exactly how it is people with disabilities use a website or an app. Because with the adaptive technology, our methods of navigating a website or a screen are much more limited than an able bodied person's would be, and understanding how I consume the information can really help somebody that's trying to make the effort to build a more accessible online world. So he was great at that. Also, the people at audioeye.com, which is an enterprise level accessibility company, they hired me to be a writer for them. And at first, I tried to talk them out of hiring me for like 3 or 4 times. And I say a lot of things for entertainment purposes, but that's not for entertainment purposes. I was convinced that they did not know who I was or who they really wanted because I wasn't it. But what they finally helped me understand is they wanted somebody who could use storytelling to make concepts of accessibility come alive in the minds of readers in a way that not everybody can do. So it's been about a 5 year journey now. First understanding that I did know stuff, and then getting to the point where I see myself as a thought leader and an expert, and really working on helping as many businesses as I can take advantage of the disability community. Because as you mentioned, it's a huge market. Most companies are ignoring people with disabilities, not out of any type of malice, just out of having too many things to do, or as they say, you don't know what you don't know. So the companies that are willing to make an investment in accessibility do stand out, and I strongly encourage small business owners and new startups to invest in accessibility in the beginning because it's one of the best ways they can gain a competitive advantage over larger, more established firms in the same niche. I mean, because if you're new, if you're small, if you don't have a lot of budget, you don't have a lot of power, your voice ain't very loud yet, you want to stand out. And sadly, you can stand out by being accessible.
And you write quite a bit on the Blind Blogger. Is that the best place for people to connect with you?
I think the best place for people to connect with me is my LinkedIn profile, which is I'm Maxwell Ivey over there. It's Ivy as in Victor EY, and because I'm still trying to figure out how to combine all of Max's various personalities into one piece
Okay.
of. I mean, because there's the carnival owner, and the carnival stuff is kind of like my origin story. You wouldn't expect Spider-Man to stop talking about the arachnid and the nuclear whatever that caused him to be who he is. And then there's the equipment brokering, and there's sharing inspirational and motivational messages, even if I'm not actually coaching. There's the work I do as a podcaster, not only my own show and being a guest, but helping others understand. And then we've got the accessibility stuff, and so with all that I've done and continue to do, I feel like I got about five personalities, and I don't really have one website where it all comes together except for my LinkedIn profile.
LinkedIn's a great place. Yeah, a
You
great
know,
place to
it's
connect.
it's a great place to connect. It's a very professional place. It's nowhere, in my opinion, it's still nothing like any of the other quote social media platforms unquote. And my goal is in 2026. I filed for a domain name as part of doing a public speaking thing in March, and because I wanted a URL I could put on my business card in Braille. And when you put something on Braille, it takes more room to print Braille than it does to print ink. So we filed for Maxwell Ivey and maxivey.com. And so my goal in 2026 is to find a way to use one of those two URLs to bring everything together under one website that I can just say, go to maxivey.com. That would be so cool. So, but for
Sure.
now, go to linkedin.com/in/Maxwell Ivey.
And of course, the goal of a lot of entrepreneurs is to get people off of those platforms because we don't own the platforms. LinkedIn, we could write the wrong thing and they deplatform us. I have a friend who came on the podcast. I didn't know him until he became a guest, Travis Holzum. He talks about permaculture and turning your backyard into a food forest. It was a very popular episode. And I believe it was Meta, which is Facebook and
Right.
Instagram, locked him out. He had 33 different accounts. He had business going on in multiple states, and they just switched it off. And he never could get anybody on the phone. And I think that went on for 3 months. It had a devastating impact on his business. So the importance of having a website is you can direct people off of those platforms onto something that you own and control. But I wanted to get to something that you mentioned in your background that shocked me because it corrected a misconception that I had. I actually assumed in the early 2000s that the internet had already implemented a lot of accessibility, and I read that you had to write some of your own code to get some things done. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Right. So in 2007, when I'm starting my first website, the Midway Marketplace, to help people broker their surplus amusement equipment, at that time there was three ways to build a website. One was you hired somebody and paid them thousands of dollars, and that's not an exaggeration. People
Right.
were getting paid thousands of dollars in the early 2000s to build simple websites. The second option was what you see is what you get, or WYSIWYG, which wouldn't have worked for me. And then the third option was building a website by learning to code HTML, which I went to the W3C.org website and taught myself one type of code at a time, from creating a page to adding links to adding images to embedding your email address. And basically, to use the old Johnny Cash song, I did it one piece at a time. And
That's a great song.
oh, it's a
Great
great song.
tune.
So and the thing is I understand that building a website with HTML is hard, and is just the amount of time you have to put into it, because everything you do requires writing lines of text code or HTML code. But you're really writing it in text characters, and the internet is converting it into the HTML when you save the document. But the thing I actually liked about HTML, and I have days now where I think, man, some things were a lot easier when I just coded them instead of depending on WordPress, is there's a simplicity and a symmetry to HTML. Now, I never did Java or PHP. If I needed something fancier, I would go on a forum and somebody would let me copy and paste their code, or I'd find an open source company that would let me, that I could embed. But pretty much, everything in HTML, if you have an opening quote, you have to have a closing quote. If you have a less than, there has to be a greater than. If you have a bracket, there has to be a closed bracket. And once you figure out the format and the symmetry, then it's really just a matter of doing the same thing over and over, who knows how many thousand or hundred thousands of times. It's, basically like if you're going to make cookies and you've got those old plastic cookie cutters, you set them into the dough and you peel the dough out. Well, if you do it long enough, you got a gross of cookies in the kitchen. And that's kind of the way it is with HTML. And it was hard to learn. It was hard to do the work. Sometimes it was hard to figure out how to make things all work together. But as far as level of difficulty, I honestly, I'm saying this sincerely. There are days where I'm more frustrated by WordPress than I ever was by HTML.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, it makes sense. If there was a symmetry to HTML, if there's a logic to it, it does seem like, because certain things are intuitive and certain things are non-intuitive. And as we talked about kind of in the pre-show discussion, there are products and companies that intentionally create friction in certain products to try to
Yeah.
encourage certain behaviors and not to do other behaviors. Now, since I used it on the thumbnail, I want to make sure we cover this too. Traveling and letting strangers take the pictures. Can you give us just a nutshell explanation of what that experience was like? Because it's very brassy to do have because I travel alone quite a bit and to some places that people say I'm crazy and I've never had any trouble. But when I read your story, I thought, no, this guy's really brassy. He's really taking chances.
Uh, it actually started with a podcast interview because I knew I was going to New York as part of my writer in residence prize, and I knew I wanted to take pictures because I didn't know when the next time I would get to leave the house would be. And so I'm interviewing Michael Schwartz, who's an amazing gentleman. He's a former award-winning video photographer who, as he likes to say, is losing his sight but not his storyteller's vision. And I had him on my podcast like 3 or 4 months before I went to New York. I said, what do you do? I said, because you obviously can't see everything you're photographing. He said, well, Max, what you do is you get the widest possible angle lens you can get, and you take as much film as you can take, and then you find somebody you trust to sort it out in editing. He says, because you can edit stuff down and you can decide not to use pictures if you have too many, but you can't fix things if you have to expand them or if you didn't take enough pictures. So my nephew bought me this really simple Canon DSLR, and it wasn't expensive enough that I felt like I'd have to worry about somebody stealing it from me. Plus, I have a motto I like to use when I'm meeting people, regardless of where I'm at, which is you meet the people you expect to meet. And so
Okay.
I
Yeah.
tend to expect the best out of people. And so most of the time that happens, there are some places I would not go on, I would avoid on purpose because it's known that they're not safe areas. But for the most part, so I took this little camera, and whenever I thought I had an idea for a good photo, I would just ask somebody to take the pictures for me. And I had pictures taken by waiters, the pedal taxi driver,
That's great.
the skate guards at Rockefeller Center. My favorite pictures in the book were taken by the Secret Service agents at Trump Tower because when I went in 2016, that was one of the places everybody was going in New York, regardless of their political affiliation. It just became a thing, and so the Secret Service agents there, I went in the building and I mentioned that I was going to rest up for a few minutes before I went to my next destination, but that I was disappointed because I didn't get any pictures because the security guards at the building told me they couldn't help me take any, and the Secret Service guy says, "We'll fix that." So after they X-rayed my bag, the Secret Service guy took pictures of me with other Secret Service guy and with
Oh,
some
that's great.
firemen. And at the end, I said, you know, you've been really good about this. I just want to know, you know, is there a chance I could get you to take a picture or get one of these other guys to take a picture that makes it look like you're about to rough me up? And he said, sure. And of course, I have no way of reviewing the photo for myself, but I'm told that it is a very playful picture for a Secret Service guy. And who knows if it had happened this year instead of 2016, it might have got somebody fired. I don't know.
Right, right. No,
But
I love that.
the
I love
but
that
the, yeah,
approach.
but the thing is I came home with a little over 200 pictures,
Wow.
and my editor worked it down to 60 of the best pictures. And then in some pictures, people's faces were clear, so she blurred out some faces so that I wouldn't have to worry about the copyright issues with
Oh,
those
okay.
people. And so I have this book. It's a 300-page book of the experience of competing for and winning the award, and then going to New York, and a lot of the things that went into going and enjoying my time while I was there. It's a great motivational and travel book. I've been told that's why I didn't do better on the bestseller list because it's not one or the other. It's both, and things that are
Ah,
more than one thing, don't always sell real well on the internet. It's one of those niche things that you talked about, but it's my favorite book, and it's one of those books. And even now, if I give it to people who don't know me, they want to know who took the pictures.
sure, Max. Can you give us the title to that as well? Because I did
Sure.
see that on Amazon.
Right. So that's the Blind Bloggers New York City Adventure: How You Can Make Your Dreams Come True. And
Fantastic.
And besides the experiences at the end of each chapter, there's some reminders of motivational suggestions for the people that are reading the book. And I have to thank my editor for putting those in because I would have never thought to put those in. I had enough trouble thinking to write the book. The one thing about the book, though, is I wrote some of it before I left, and some of it while I was gone, and some of it when I got home. So my editor is. It took a while for her to get over being mad at me because of all the tense changes in the book. She spent more
Ah,
time. She spent more time editing the verb tense than she did editing the rest of the you know.
we
But she's a really nice woman, and we've been friends for a long time. And when I finish this next book, she will definitely be the person I reach out to help me get it published.
fantastic. So share with us, Max. What book do you have coming up?
Well, I did the first book on my New York City trip. I did a second book about going out and working to promote my writing through book signings and public speaking. And so I'm working on a third book that will tie all of that in together with my what I consider my highlight walk out of the movie and cheer moment, which was speaking at Podfest in 2020 on the topic of overcoming your excuses, facing your fears, and finally publishing your podcast. And even though I followed Dave Jackson, I ended up with a standing ovation for my talk on helping people overcome their excuses. And I feel like that's a good ending point for that book. I just need to find the time to write it. Thankfully, I've been blessed with many paid writing assignments for publications. Not most of them not at the same level as Consumer Reports, but when you self-publish a book, you have a lot of expenses. You pay for the editing, the formatting, the ISBN numbers, the cover art. And as I like to tell my brother, I'm like, Patrick, I would rather write where they pay me than write where I have to pay them.
That's right. Yeah, the traditional publisher where they just pick you up and hand you a big, front
Yeah,
check and go from
yeah,
there.
yeah. I'd like to do that too. And about once a year, I actually send some query letters out. Sadly, none of them are ever going to be interested in my travel books because the big publishers don't like to touch anything that's already been self-published,
That's correct.
unless you become a huge personality because you're either famous or infamous, and then they'll be like, well, that person has really big influence right now. So then they will look at some previously published stuff. But to this point, when I've done queries, it's always been, do you have a book that isn't related to these other two books that you could do? And so I every so often I pitch a book of short stories based on my experiences growing up in a carnival family and also growing up losing my vision. And I've also occasionally pitched a nonfiction book on accessibility because I know there are lots of people who've written about the technical standards and they've written, let's call them textbook type approaches to accessibility. But I really think that there's a market for a book on accessibility that includes some good storytelling from a good storyteller.
I believe so too. Yeah, there has to be a market out there. And of course, it's a great niche. I learned a lot about the hearing impaired community in 2008 because I had an art gallery and I hired a gentleman who here's what's interesting about this because there's a little bit of similarity to your story. When he was born, he was able to hear, and then he lost his hearing at 8. And what I didn't understand at the time, and he really educated me about this, is that there are even I guess the best way to call it is factions inside the deaf community. There are
Yes, there
people
are.
and I had no, I just thought, well, they're such a tiny group. Of course, they're all going to band together. Absolutely not. There are people that are very against getting the cochlear implants. They think it's unnatural. And then there's the community between the people that were born deaf and the people that later lost their hearing. Do you have the same thing in vision impaired community?
We sometimes have a little trouble over language, but we tend to get along. There have been a few like cases where it didn't make any sense why we took particular sides. Sometimes our advocacy groups will get sideways with each other over the right answer. Like for
Oh my
example,
goodness.
when more and more cars started going to hybrid or full electric,
Mhm.
there was a debate over whether we should push manufacturers to have engines that make noise because most people aren't aware of this. When a blind person does a street crossing, they're generally taking their cues from the motor engines to determine when they should start crossing a street, and they also take cues from those engines to try to figure out the traffic pattern as to when people are moving, especially if you have two lane or more roads crossing each other and you have to figure out when the left turn lane is going. So uh, a lot of people, I'm one of those people. I'm like, why didn't we make them put noisemakers on those engines? But there were other people who were like, that just would be silly. It would be demeaning to blind people. I'm like, it might be demeaning, but it would be a safety issue. A little later on, there's a thing called audio descriptions or described audio, where if you listen to a movie or TV show on a secondary audio track, you can hear narrators describing the action whenever there's not dialogue
Oh,
taking place. And the first time there was a law about that in the U.S., it was passed, and it was a few months later the television industry went to court. They went in front of the FCC to get the law withdrawn. And as a group, we didn't fight for the audio descriptions the way I think we should have. And we allowed them to be withdrawn, and it was like 5 or 6 years before the FCC did it again. And the first time they did it, it would have applied to all broadcast television. The second time they did it, and I don't know what the current law is. I understand there was a schedule where the hours would be expanded over time, but the first version of the current law was that 50 hours a quarter had to be described of broadcast television. Well, how much broadcast television is there anymore?
right.
And of that, how far does 50 hours a quarter get you when there's 3 hours of primetime shows 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year? You
Yeah, that's a
know,
drop in the bucket.
it's
And
a drop in the bucket.
you
And so they,
educated me, Max, because I didn't even realize it existed. First of all, I'm aware of closed captioning, and I'm sitting here thinking, wow, I didn't even know. So again, if if they do change the requirements, so I just want to tie it back in because I talk a lot about the law and legislation, both
Mhm.
on the podcast and privately. I'm a big fan of understanding it because I think people get abused when they don't understand the law or they don't understand the legislative process. And it's also a business competitive advantage to understand if there's about to be a change. So let's say they change that and they say, look, it's not going to be 50 hours, it's going to be 500 hours, and it's going to be across all internet. Well, the first thing I think as an entrepreneur is people are going to have to rush in, and that's a massive business opportunity. I mean, obviously you're helping the community as well too, but you have to keep the lights on. So that's going to open up a whole new market, and there's not immediately going to be a lot of competition. So if you're first and you're fast and you're good at it and you make up for that gap between the 50 and the 500 hours, that could be a landmark opportunity.
Yes, it could. Yes, it could. And you know, here's you talk about laws and the way they take place. They always take a long time. And the first thing most large businesses will do is to try to figure out a way to avoid complying with them, which is why I emphasize educating business owners about the advantages of accessibility, because the regulatory side of it, the compliance, is only going to get us so far. So, right now there's been a lot of talk about how the European Accessibility Act is going to force businesses over there to become more accessible. And to a certain extent, it probably will. And there is a market opening up in the EAA for people who know accessibility. However, those companies aren't going to just decide overnight to hire you. People are still going to have to stake their claim to their part of that niche as an expert, as somebody who can communicate with developers, as someone who can educate teams and explain concepts in easy to understand language. But I think as well as I do, there are going to be a lot of companies that are going to be figuring out how can they delay, and what are the minimum requirements so that they can meet the letter of the law, even if they don't meet the spirit of true inclusion.
That's right.
So
That's
so
right.
you're
They
right.
call the laws the, sorry.
Understanding the way laws work is very important. And I think the most thing we can understand about laws is they generally are not going to achieve the things that we think they're going to achieve. And sometimes there are some really positive or negative unintended consequences of new laws. So,
Yes, yes, yes,
you know,
absolutely.
living in an, here's one of those things, seeing it from both sides of the fence, is I can see where living in an international business world like we do nowadays, I could see some companies deciding either to relocate or not to do business in the European Union, or not to do business online. I could see businesses deciding, okay, that law doesn't apply to me here in the U.S., at least not directly, but if I comply with that law now, it gives me an advantage over my competitors who still want to do business in Europe.
That's
And
right.
so it really just depends on how the company looks at the new law. I'm hopeful that a lot of US based businesses are going to want to improve accessibility because they're global companies. But the one thing I learn about businesses all the time is there are many, many huge corporations with large teams and large budgets who either don't do accessibility or do it very poorly. And then you have lots of small and medium sized companies that really don't have those kinds of resources that manage to find a way to do it. One of the reasons why I'm very blessed to be associated with Podmatch. I mean, there's three people running that company, and they're doing accessibility better than Amazon and self-publishing.
I've
And I
really
don't,
been bragging
yeah,
on them. They do a great job with a skeleton crew. Before we get too deep into that, I just wanted to say that although I didn't feel like I got a lot from college because I went at 30 and I had already been an entrepreneur and I got a business degree, but I do remember one professor really knocking my socks off when they said that the law is the moral minimum. And it goes right to the heart of what you just said a moment ago. And he said, look, if you're going to be an ethical company, he goes, if you obey the law, you're only at the moral minimum. And he said, if you really want to be a good company and make positive change, you have to go way above. So whatever the law is, far exceed that as far as compliance is concerned.
I'm gonna have to remember that. That's a because I'm a storyteller, not a copywriter, but I'm because that's a very succinct way of explaining what I'm trying to get across to a lot of people. That
He
it
was
is.
a heck of a professor, Max. You would have really liked him. And I hate to say it, but I think there were only three or four professors there that made any impression on me. And that's not to naysay the other professors or the school. It's just I was very much a square peg in a round hole, and I was much older than most of the other students. So, but when he said that, yeah, he was a brilliant guy. He had done business in the real world, unlike some of the other teachers there. But in wrapping up, Max, we do know that you want people to connect with you on LinkedIn. Of course, we're both fans and members of Podmatch, and Alex Sanfilippo and his team are doing a great job. Is there anything else you want to share with people or anything you want to direct them to?
No, I would just say that if they are, if after hearing us talk about this, they've decided they want to learn, they want to do more to make their organization's online presence accessible, then I hope they'll reach out to me. I'm not one of those people that you have to be ready to hire, book, or buy something from to have a conversation. And I also feel like it's easier for me to answer awkward questions than it is to make people guess. So
I
please,
love that. I love
please,
it.
please
I
do
love it.
reach out on LinkedIn or at theaccessibilityadvantage.com. And I'm more than happy to have a short chat. Who knows? Maybe you have a business idea you want to talk about on my podcast. Maybe you would like to discuss your experience with accessibility. And really, I want my platform to be a place that not only educates people, but also allows those making the effort to do the right thing, that gives them the opportunity to brag about themselves and their teams a little. Because one thing that aggravates me, I have no understanding why this is the companies that are investing in accessibility, for some reason, they rarely let people know that they're doing hard work to improve access. So I really want my podcast to not just be about educating others, but to be about places where we promote companies, brands, products, and services that are making the effort.
That's fantastic. If you have the ability, which you do, to have the platform to shine the spotlight, it will definitely, when other companies that are not as compliant, that aren't as cooperative, that aren't as helpful, see that, you know, it's going to make a lot of sense to them from a public relations standpoint to get on board with that. Well, thank you so much, Max. I appreciate your time. That's Maxwell Ivey, everybody, and he is also known as the Blind Blogger. You can find him on LinkedIn, and he's also working with and for Podmatch, a great organization. Thank you so much for your